Jak pan może, wrzuci pan teraz podgląd. Transmisja poszła.
Testing.
Powitać, co mniej więcej będzie, tak? A chyba, że ktoś sobie już oglądając powiększył obraz u siebie.
Where would you sit here?
Have to operate the side where to sit to the left.
Na komputerze siedzi, to może rzucić go na pole tak.
So you prefer this one?
Yes, thank you.
Whichever you prefer. Do you prefer the one?
No, I should grab that.
Okay.
I don't like to hold it in my hand.
Yeah, same here. Anyway, there's a paper, two sides of which one has to do. Right. Actually, this has become so small. And they will eat it.
Za minutę.
Jak będzie słychać. A, bo to idzie do uprawnienia ministra. To i tak dobrze.
This is Stuart.
Yes, yes.
And you are a Forster expert.
Well, you flatter me, but I don't know how much of an expert is. Life, studying, don't know, I don't. Word expert.
Nie będzie źle zbierał. Dobrze, do tyłu dajemy.
No do przodu, żeby było widać tylko tych mówiących.
Dobrze. Opuszczamy.
Jak jeszcze tym można.
Tak, ja już chcę tylko kamerkę opuścić.
This isn't all this less. The amount of my work and all this. And I can have read everything she's written.
Wow, well, that's saying something. Very prestigious.
That is true.
I haven't read everything.
For an undergraduate student, Forster is prodigious as well. And so the first chapter thesis on Forster's passage.
That's a kind of point of departure. Lovely.
And you know, Lessing's point of entry. Not much is going on.
Are you from the capital originally?
New Delhi.
Yes.
That's it.
Capital.
Yes. Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you so
I
much.
was just there recently, recruiting from university, actually.
Really?
This is lovely to meet the students, the high school students, yeah, at university. We did an all Hong Kong delegation doing an all India tour. It was quite exhausting.
I just a question.
We started in Mumbai,
My new laptop is meant to so today go to
the students that
That's
write
interesting.
via email.
email
Yes, somewhere.
Yeah.
See
Okay, of course. My presentation will be
Connectivity and
So I only enough time, but
well, and that all.
My debut on these, my sister
but my computer doesn't have a USB.
SCAD.
So they both were there for a year. She's done so many illustrations. Both of them are very good.
But they don't have
And then they went to Georgia, Atlanta, finished there. But not bad.
Shall we?
Yeah, I think we can
Do we,
start.
okay, will all of the panelists be up here, or should we just go one by one?
I think we should go one by one.
Yes, one by one.
That's my theory.
No, one by one, yes.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Stuart Christie. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was just speaking with a colleague, what with COVID, and typically the underrepresentation of Forster studies in most modernism conferences. It's delightful to be surrounded by colleagues in colloquium with colleagues who all center on Forster, and what a rare and remarkable thing, at least for me, that is. I'm Stuart Christie. I'm based in Hong Kong Baptist University. I'd like to thank once again the Faculty of Humanities here at the University of Warmia and Majuri here in Olsztyn. I would also like to thank Professor Krzysztof Fordoński for and his team for continuing to helm the Internationally Enforced Society, which seems terribly important in this day and age, that you're here and that you're working so well. So thank you again. The first panel will have three presenters. I won't take too much time with extended biography, but what I will do is I will say all of the titles and the names of the speakers now, and then after colleagues have finished, then won't interrupt the flow. So the first speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ratna Raman from Sri Venkateswara College in Delhi. Her paper, as you will hear shortly, is entitled Rereading: A Passage to India in its Centenary Year, A Bridge Over Troubled Waters, or A Passage to More Than India. The second paper will be offered by Dr. Tsung-Han at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. The title of this paper is Which India, Whose Passage? The New Translation of A Passage to India and Taiwan. And the third and final presentation will be offered by Professor Krzysztof Fordoński of the University of Warsaw. And the title of his paper is A Passage to India in Translation Overview. I note that there is a session hard and fast following on this one with some exciting news. David Scourfield and Howard Booth will be presenting the new critical edition of E.M.F. Forster's novels. So given that we're moving right into that, what I will do, if it's all right with the panelists, I'll just, around about 20 minutes or so, I'll just signal wrapping up time, and then I'll try my best. We began 10 minutes over, so David and Howard, if, with your permission, will aim for around about 1:30 or so for that. So without further ado, let's please welcome Professor Ratna Raman.
Thank you. My paper is looking at the relevance of A Passage to India and its centenary year. English literature played a significant role in the shaping of modernity in various parts of the world, because it was primarily the language of power in all these parts. The writer-poet, as the muse and conscience keeper of his times, carried on a tradition that began when literature slowly began interrogating the congregational practices conducted by priests across culture. Assuming the functions of both liturgy and song, as a poet-writer spoke to his or her congregation through a written text, always in a one-on-one relationship with the reader. This cosmic aspect of literature remains significant in the examination of the interaction between religious communities and the colonial state in A Passage to India. Yet, what of heaven and the soul and damnation that sacred literatures around the world have leaned in upon to exemplify our understanding of good and evil, and how it manifests itself in the temporal world? Graceful and Sorley, in A Passage to India, make light of souls that can be, make a list of souls that can be saved with the clarity that, quote, the non-living must be left out in order to, quote, exclude someone from a gathering. Ironically, Despite professing love for all living species, every religious group in power thrives upon exclusionary practices, othering the non-believer. This is relevant to us today in a world that is in conflagration in many parts, where state-sponsored genocides continue on the assumption that an entire people can be decimated. The ultrasound and the MRI may have conclusively established that the human anatomy possesses no soul, yet still we continue to foster ideas of beauty and spirituality in a world that can often become extremely sordid. With a tripartite structure that discusses three dominant religious cultures in the 20th century, E.M. Forster's fictional Chandrapur pushes the reader through the muddle that is being created in a part of India in the lives of three communities, the Hindus, the Muslims and the Christians. This complication is of course not located in endless cyclical time, but has a historical and political context and shows us how different cultural perceptions make the process of everyday living extremely complex at the personal, social, spiritual and political level, in the private and the public sphere, to say nothing of the cosmic. That we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of A Passage to India here in Olsen is in itself an extraordinary moment, and reiterates the imperative need to revisit great texts and contexts that add nuance to understanding. Forster's two visits to India, the first one long after the Great Mutiny of 1857 and before World War I, produced a blueprint, and the second visit after the war fed deeply into the narrative, recording his critical responses to Christianity and his fielding persona, who does not want to take sides and register his distance from the control and apartheid practiced by the officials of the colonial state. Forster's relationship with Christianity, his great friendship with Masood, to whom the book is dedicated, and his own work in the Hindu state of Devas feed into his narrative, other than his reading of the Hindu text itself. The India of the 1920s was a period of ferment. Indians received training in Western education, law and medicine, travelled abroad, and a sizable number of them resisted and refused to cooperate with the colonial regime, being deeply invested in issues of freedom, democracy, and the oppression and exploitation of India as a colony. The exchange between Hamidullah and Muhammad Ali in chapter 2 register the shift from cordial relationships between the Muslims and the British, replaced by hostility and suspicion due to the overweening arrogance and fear of British officialdom. Only Queen Victoria and Mrs. Bannister are evoked as examples of humane English women. The ashy dust of 1857 is probably in the air and explains perhaps the hostility and rudeness that characterizes seasoned colonial white behavior. The fact that Aziz could have operated on an appendix more effectively and saved a life is a private conviction held by the civil surgeon, while McBride's racial profiling of Aziz as a criminal is because he lives at a specific latitude. Clearly, there is discomfort at the top about dissent. Forster's narration of race and class and caste is well done, but his delineation of female gender follows patterns and expectations that spill over largely from the 19th century and which remain disturbingly patriarchal. Forster abandons the geographic boundaries of the European novel and decenters Occidental perspective to allow other voices from the Indian heartland to speak, and A Passage to India remains significant as one of the earliest novels written by an Englishman about India. Yet, Chandrapur, except for the Marabar caves, a nondescript and ordinary city with ineffective temples, a few fine houses down filthy alleys, and the river Ganges that trails along the bank, quote, scarcely distinguishable from the rubbish it deposits so freely, unquote. This is the Occidental gaze, encountering something entirely different from the perspectives offered by Venice, Grasmere, Egypt, Crete, etc. Disconcerted by the extreme weather in latitudes beyond 23 degrees, exposed to unfamiliar Hindu concepts, and an alien landscape can be a troubling experience. And add to this the complex terrain of the caves and Mao as well. Forster's criticism of the insular colonial English community wielding administrative power in Chandrapur is heartwarming for any colonized or racialized subject. British administrators in charge of law and order in India are shown at close quarters, believing in the liberty, fraternity and equality of the white man, which is also available by proxy for the white woman who follows the rule. Forster is sharply critical of the British in India and shows us how they follow ideologically in the footsteps of their Anglo-Saxon brethren in America who believed in manifest destiny, wherein people of other races are viewed as belonging to a different species, predominantly disappointing, unreliable and dysfunctional at that. The colonial rulers are white, racial supremacists wielding power in order to bring education, justice and civilization to the natives. Forster's delineation of Turton, Callender, McBride and Hislop is a sharp satirical commentary on this predominant mindset. The wives of the said Turton, McBride and Miss Derrick also display continuous disdain for the Indians they interact with. Social interaction documented among the Hindus, Muslims and Christians in personal and public spheres suggests that nascent connections and differences were formed a long while back. Aziz opines that it was irrelevant, quote, that a few flabby Hindus had preceded him here and a few chilly English succeeded, unquote. The possibility of syncretism or coexistence significant in our times, where Islamophobia continues to be the order of the day and all of Asia continues to be viewed as chaotic and disorderly. The narrative impetus of the novel follows the broad pattern of the comic tradition of the English novel and remains corrective in nature. The novel, set in troubled peacetime, reveals the hierarchy in relationships between white men and women, as well as the hierarchies between white people and Indians, derisively referred to as niggers. Significantly, unveiled white women such as Mesdames Callender, Leslie and McBride, opinionated and inflexible, treat all Indians with disdain and provide for popular stereotypes of the white woman who is a native hater. All Indian women are shown to be in parda and are predominantly non-speaking subjects. Chandrapur's Hamidullah Begum informs Aziz that being an unmarried woman of 30 is a terrible slur, quote, for wedlock, motherhood and power in the house, unquote, ordained by God, were cruelly denied to her by man. The entrenched English community denies Indians admittance to the club, providing us with a reality check on the thin veneer of civilized white behavior and the abject position of the significant Indians who work under them. The collectors' bridge party for Adela and Mrs. Moore to see the real India and meet Indians is not a success because there is no social connect between the colonizers and the natives, and unhappy murmurs are heard from both sides. The bridge party fails as the invited guests remain awkward, unequal, uncomfortable and collectively unwelcome. Minor disruptions make it a lackluster event. The natives do not outdo themselves, and shortly thereafter, Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested are stood up and deprived of their opportunity to visit an Indian home as the car from the Bhattacharya household never arrives to pick them up. Fielding's tea party, on the other hand, hosted at his residence on the grounds of the government college, allows Mrs. Moore and Adela to interact with a Muslim Aziz and a Hindu Godbelly. The tea party is the starting point of Aziz and Fielding's friendship, and the visit to the Marabar caves is first proposed here, recalibrating the best laid plans of the colonial administration. Different cultural expectations seem to exacerbate situations. Do the Bhattacharyas, who renege on sending a car for Mrs. Quested and Mrs. Moore, thereby constricting famed Indian hospitality, represent unwieldy Bengal, which nudged the shift in the colonial headquarters from Calcutta to New Delhi in 1911. Hislop sneering at Aziz's missing collar pin as incontrovertible evidence of the shortcomings of the educated Indian displays a racial contempt no longer thinly disguised, and an absence of sensitivity that the reader is alert to, knowing that Aziz offered his only collar stud to Fielding, who had broken his. Why does Ronnie Hislop strive to be a just magistrate? Why does he foreclose his options of understanding his mother's point of view or empathizing with the Indians he interacts with? The reader dislikes most of the British officials in Chandrapur and identifies instinctively with Mrs. Moore, who observes through fraught exchanges between the Indians and the British, concluding that, quote, man is nowhere near understanding man. The omniscient narrator, meanwhile, reiterates that we need an opening out of our hearts to empathy, compassion, and love. Mrs. Moore responds to India and Indians with a sense of interest and open-mindedness and renews her engagement with a religion that is also practiced by the, quote, arrogant and venal Englishwomen disliked by Aziz and his friends. Fielding's openness to India and Indians, unlike that of Mrs. Moore's, comes from his atheism, from the opposite end of the spectrum. In a world where Christian missionaries, Greyford and Sorley, constituting the soft arm of colonization, expound their theological beliefs of inclusivity. APTI becomes the churning pot in which religion and race play a significant role in shaping and determining lives and destinies. Fielding, the college principal, and Aziz, the medical surgeon, function at the outset as outliers. Aziz, proud of his Muslim roots, looks up to the lineage of 6 heroic Mughal rulers from Babur to Alamgir and would like to march forward into modernity from the hidebound past on the wings of poetry. Aziz resentfully cycles through roads named after victorious generals, intersecting at right angles, which were symbolic of the net Great Britain had thrown over India. He felt caught in their meshes, quote unquote. And his aha moment at the mosque, where he says, here was Islam, his own country, more than a faith, more than a battle cry, much, much more Islam, an attitude towards life, both exquisite and durable, unquote. A Passage to India examines at close quarters the spaces occupied by religion in the first quarter of the 20th century. Although Marx's idea of religion as the opiate of the masses did gain currency all over the world, alongside an increase in the self-determination of several nations and people, APTI shows us that religion is alive and well and functioning, not merely as the opiate of the masses, but also as the spur and goad used by the classes. While A Passage to India reinforces the staying power of religion reflected through cultural practices in different communities, it comes nowhere near fathoming the space occupied by the Pankha Pola and many others described as, quote, mostly villagers, for whom anything outside their villages passed in a dream. These were the toiling riot whom some call the real India, unquote. Oddly enough, even today it is this section of Indians, overlooked and neglected, who are both becoming more vocal and visible. 100 years later, after religion continues to control and regulate lives across the spectrum, all over the world and in India in particular, where the most recent elections were fought on the platform of building a temple for the Hindu god Ram, reiterating Hindu triumph after the Babri Masjid that had earlier stood on the same spot for over 400 years had been reduced to rubble. Yet the, quote, mild-featured, unquote, men and women of the same district did not vote the candidate representing the right-wing political party to power. Perhaps theirs was a refusal to endorse hate-driven politics of the state. Forster's engagement with Hinduism begins with God Bole's song, beseeching God to show himself to the devotee in Chandrapur. God does not show up, and the reader is taken to Mao to view him, wherein God Bole has relocated. God Bole, as a comic, eccentric and devout Hindu, is not particularly endearing. The word God Bole can be split into God, which is an English word, and Bole, which is a Hindi word, and could imply taking the name of God or suggest that God himself was speaking. And we all know that when God speaks, it's, pretty obscure what he is really saying. God Bole's song highlights the eternal clamor for the presence of the Lord Krishna, who does not appear despite all plaintive evocations. The song perplexes, and the tea party itself does not bode well for multiracial exchanges. And the day trip to the Malabar caves creates an echoing boom that reverberates in boomerangs, threatening to disrupt race relations altogether. The outing gone wrong at the Malabar caves definitely suggests that tourism and sightseeing have yet to come of age. Although neither science nor psychology are advanced enough to interpret the claustrophobia and suffocation felt by Mrs. Moore and the subsequent disruption that Adela undergoes inside a dark, sunlit, unlit cave. Racial prejudices rear their ugly head through Aziz's arrest and jail term. The use of Aziz's personal correspondence to impute criminal intent and motive is humiliating. The British seem threatened by the ghost of native insurrection, and McBride's affair with Miss Derrick and his subsequent divorce proceedings highlight the hypocritical double standard. Had Adela Quested not withdrawn her complaint, Aziz would have been behind bars all his life. This fact reveals that things can go terribly wrong and that laws by themselves, in the absence of human kindness and intuitive fellow feelings, serve little purpose. Yet Adela's gesture or her perspective is not engaged with at all by anyone in the novel or by Fielding. Aziz's trial provides a grave warning about how racial and communal prejudices violate the rights of small private individuals and vitiate all possibility of justice, even in the most modern of courts. Yeah. An ancient Mrs. Moore, a liberal Fielding, a Hindu Godbole, and a progressive Muslim Aziz are unable to alter the course of events in any way, stymied by the juggernaut of hostility and distrust. Despite his eccentricities, Godbole comes across as a decent human being and a practicing Hindu, and plunges us into intense philosophic speculations about the nature of good and evil. He also extends support to a beleaguered Aziz through relocation and employment at Mao. At Mao, we find that Aziz has abandoned mainstream medicine and is no longer its spokesperson, and that Fielding is willing to come on board in some part, quote, with the oppressors of India, unquote. Neither of these two positions are tenable in the context of 21st century India, although revisiting older systems of healing outside of allopathy is currently a work in progress. A passage to India significantly provides us with the context of the three major religious traditions that existed in India at the time of Forster's visit 100 years after. The empire has withered away. Graceford and Solly, long deceased, have been replaced by devout congregations through the length and breadth of the country. Yet, communal strife continues to raise its ugly head, foisted upon the shoulders of political power. This scenario repeatedly plays out in contemporary India, if not all over the world. For the ordinary citizen, hierarchies of race, class, religion, as well as exacerbated gender rights continue to distress, while the modern state treats the ordinary citizen with distrust and instills shock, fear, and awe. A passage to India, by drawing us into dialogues around different religious faiths, highlights the interconnectedness of human beings belonging to different communities. The tensions in Chandrapur are resolved a few years later at Mao. Aziz accepts Godbole's offer, for this job allows him to maintain his dignity and remains supportive of his general weal. It also allows him to spend time with his children and raise them. This space of mutual coexistence must not be lost sight of in its entirety. In contemporary India, the less empowered Muslim remains besieged by an ugly, coercive paternalism extended top-down by strident Hindus in a majoritarian manner for the greater part of this century. The millennial crash between Islam and Christianity in Europe has been replaced by a tri-cornered combat between Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity in India. Other variants of interreligious clashes manifest in different parts of the world: Gaza, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Mizoram, and Ukraine, for instance. The elderly Mrs. Moore, impatient at the bother stirred up by the quotidian, tries to unsuccessfully reclaim the values of love and kindness. The text repeatedly signals that connectedness and empathy are important values that humans must take cognizance of. This 100-year-old wisdom would be a valid assumption to proceed upon in current times, where civility and tolerance remain the only way forward, along with the matter of keeping one's religious convictions to oneself and focusing on a spiritual life. Despite the shift in power from the British to Indians, the fault lines in Indian society exist. although the fractures around political inequality and religious difference played out differently in the aftermath of independence. To connect and to love become important markers in this teaching text, an idea distilled from all the religions of the world, and the novel presciently evokes India's future independence as a nation. A Passage to India ends with Aziz coveting the easy friendship between Fielding, Adela, and the three Heathrows. Arguably, such friendships existed then as they do now among Indian men and women. Indian women have also made significant progress despite the prevalence of the ghungat in North India and the presence of the parda all over the country. We not only have our own versions of Mrs. Moore, Miss Quested and Miss Derrick, but women successful in public life on several counts and brilliant administrators, teachers, dancers, musicians, scientists and doctors, to say nothing of powerful political leaders. Were such women non-existent 100 years ago? Not really. Women in Europe fought hard for rights, and the battle for suffrage that began in the last quarter of the 19th century remained in progress for over 40 years, while Forster finished writing up the manuscript of A Passage to India. The subcontinent's history also comprised of incredible Indian women from multiple walks of life who embraced plural fields of knowledge and excelled in them, learning from female counterparts and peers in Europe and America, many of whom spent years in India. Forster does not fit any such women in his narrative. His persona of Fielding is dismissive of the idea of an independent India, and delighting in his impending fatherhood dismisses Aziz's poetic pleas for women's emancipation, postulating that freeing women from domesticity complicates the diurnal world of domesticity and child rearing. How is Fielding's understanding of women's roles any different from that of Hamidullah Begum's? Mrs. Moore leaves India unhappy and unwell, dies at Eden and is buried at sea. The cry, not here, not now, that Fielding and Aziz here dismantles the possibility of a continued friendship between Fielding and Aziz. New passages to India must be identified and reforged. Engaging with the women's perspective could build a durable bridge over troubled waters, resonating with the yet untested cosmic mantra of Esmis Esmur. Yes, we must chercher les femmes while we lay out the flowers we have gathered at the forgotten shrine built in memory of Mrs. Moore's in obscure Chandrapurs. Thank you.
If I may, I'll invite colleagues to defer questions until the end of this session. Thank you very much, Professor Ratna Raman. May I now invite Dr. Tsung-Han to come on the stage, please.
Thank you very much. Right, so my name is Tsung-Han Tsai, and today I'm talking about translation in Taiwan. So let's begin. Translation studies have become an established field. Now critics have recognized how translation is not just changing one language to another, but a series of cultural, ideological, and political maneuver, entangled within a web of power relations between languages, cultures, economies, and nations. Translation involves interpretations, compromises, and transactions among multiple translation players. It's inseparable from its social and political contexts, and the end product is informed by the power relations among discrete as well as interlinked human and non-human agents. In Taiwan, translation studies have specifically benefited from what has been called the sociological and cultural turn of the discipline. In recent decades, critics have increasingly paid attention to issues of colonization, censorship, and geopolitics, asking why something was or was not translated, how the social settings and apparatus determine the process of translation, and how a translation registers as well as rewrites the hierarchical relation between the source culture and the target culture. So what I would like to focus on today is specifically the latest translation of A Passage to India, to illustrate how Forster's novel in translation is not only an example of modernism's legacy and afterlife, but also it's bound up with Taiwan's continuing ideological self-positioning. So here's just some kind of disclaimer. Right, I'm Taiwanese myself, although currently I'm based in Japan, but I'm from Taiwan. That is, this new translation of a passage in Taiwan does not just indicate that the publisher saw an opportunity to introduce the novel to a newer generation of Chinese audiences, whether for educational purposes or simply to earn more money. What I find interesting is that this new translation, published in 2017, took a distinctly different approach to the original text. Together with its paratext, including the book's front and back covers, its foreword, its marketing materials, the translation suggests a new perception or new imagination of the novel's relevance to the would-be audience, and this in turn says something about 21st century Taiwan more broadly. Hence the title of my presentation, Which India, Whose Passage? Almost 100 years after its publication, the translation of the passage India in Taiwan seems to be telling a story beyond Forster's original story. So 2 background details first. First, as some might have noticed from my abstract, why is a translated work in Taiwan in traditional Chinese, not Taiwanese? Because of Chiang Kai-shek's occupation of the island in 1947 and their establishment of the Republic of China in Taiwan, the official language in Taiwan has been Mandarin Chinese for over 70 years. While there have been increasing efforts into promoting other languages, such as Taiwanese Hokkien, Hakka, and the languages used by the Chinese indigenous peoples, the dominant spoken language is still Mandarin Chinese, and the official written script has been traditional Chinese. Second, like many other countries in East and Southeast Asia, Taiwan's publishing industry has relied heavily on foreign publications. Once again, although the trend has been shifting, especially in the last decade when we have more and more local writers and their works, Taiwan's best sellers, not only in literature but also overall, tend to be translated works, mostly from English and Japanese. Both these phenomena deserve consideration on their own rights, but these are beyond the scope of my paper today, so I am mentioning them here as background information for my discussion. Before the 2017 translation, there have been 4 translations of a passage in India in traditional Chinese in Taiwan. The earliest translation came from Chen and Pingnan Zhang, published by Huaxin Publishing in 1975. Both Chen and Zhang had an academic background in English literary studies. In 1984, the film adaptation of the novel came out. In 1985, Chen and Zhang's translation was reissued by several publishers, one of which was Vista Publishing, as you can see here. In the same year, the Crown Books published a translation by Ji Qingshi, a feminist writer and educationalist. The Running Horse Publishing also published a translation by Shu Ling, likely a pseudonym. Choosing the film poster as their front cover, both translations can be seen as capitalizing on the film's release. Both publishers were more famous for publishing light literature and romance novels. Their publications were likely rushed as they cut out significant portions of the original text and contain a significant number of mistranslations, suggesting an unfamiliarity with Forster's text and its context. And then this is my subject today. In 2017, Linking Publishing Company, one of the leading publishers in Taiwan nowadays, published this new translation of the novel by Si Li as part of their series Classic. So this is the series' website. Other titles, I don't know whether you can see here. Okay, so other titles in this series include new translations of, for example, The Wasteland, Adventures of a Huckleberry Finn, A Handful of Dust, Kim, The Dublingness to the Lighthouse, Moby Dick, Burmese Days, Brideshead Revisited, and Forster's Memoirs. The translator Si Li is a professional translator, though not trained in literary studies. By 2017, he had been translating from English to Chinese for more than 15 years, his work covering a wide range of subjects from literature to economics, self-help, picture books, and popular science. This new translation of a passage to India features a foreword provided by Tsung-Han Lai, currently a professor in translation studies at National Taiwan Normal University. Lai's foreword, entitled "A Delight to Welcome a New Translation," notes how, compared to previous translations, Li's translation, I quote, has fewer mistranslations and pays more attention to context and logic. It's refrained from overusing pronouns, common in English but less so in Chinese, as it tends to create confusion, makes the prose clear and easy to understand. Li's translation, Lai concludes, is the most readable translation to date. Such readability partially comes from Li's use of extensive footnotes to provide historical information. The result is that this translation, which goes over 400 pages, is significantly longer than previous translations of the novel. But it's not just the footnotes. Language-wise, Li's translation adapts Forster's text into a more colloquial form of Chinese. It clarifies a sentence's subject and object when Forster's pronouns, if translated literally, would be difficult to understand. It extends the length of Forster's sentences by giving more details and elucidating the context, also because in the common Chinese form of Mandarin Chinese, conversation requires multiple sentence final particles to act as qualifier to suggest the relationships, attitudes, and emotions of those conversing with one another. Li's translation makes the novel's dialogue more idiomatic and thus linguistically more removed from Forster's. This translation strategy is significantly different from previous translators. The 1975 translation by Chen and Zhang is a more literal translation. They keep the sentences short and mostly retain the ordering of Forster's phrases. It's even possible to translate their translation back to English and produce a text not too dissimilar from Forster's original. If now their translation reads occasionally idiomatically awkward in Chinese and sometimes creates confusion, one can say that they are faithful to the original text. Chen and Zhang's translation, as another translation studies scholar Xi Rongzhang comments, captures the language and style of Forster's writing. So a quick look at the ways the two translations translate the end of the novel illustrate the differences. So this is Forster's original text. I highlight Forster's use of pronoun it and the final no, not yet, no, not there, very famous line. So this is the one on the top is Chen and Zhang's translation. The one at the bottom is Li's new translation. I suppose for those of you who don't even read Chinese, what immediately stands out is the difference in length. Both translations use repetition, suggesting that both attempt to recreate the cadence of Forster's sentences, but the ways they repeat certain phrases suggest different aims. While Chen and Zhang give a more literal translation, delivering a more terse and compact end to the novel, Li avoid translating Forster's it to the equivalent Chinese pronoun and instead provides the full referent and thus give the it a pinpointed meaning. While Chen and Zhang's translation is economical with words and opens up a space for its imagery to be as evocative as possible, Li's more detailed translation returns a reader's focus to the theme of cross-cultural friendship running through the novel. In short, we can say that Chen and Zhang emphasize language and style, whereas Li focuses on storytelling. This emphasis on storytelling, on readability, is capitalized upon by the novel's multiple paratexts. But under closer scrutiny, these translations' paratexts show that they cannot decide which story the novel is to tell, and sometimes that they even want to tell the wrong story. So first, the front cover is designed by a local graphic designer, Xie Jiaying, who incorporates a floral pattern, as you can see here, designed by Tanya Anisimova from the stock image website Shutterstock. The cover features a line taken from the translated text, as you can see here, pointed out by the red arrow. It's from the novel's Part 1, Chapter 2, when Aziz is reciting poems in his friend's place. The narrator describes India, 100 Indias, whisper outside beneath the indifferent moon, but for the time India seemed one and their own. But this Chinese translation is thoroughly mistranslated, which, if rendered back to English, is closer to many Indians like to read poetry softly under the moonlight outdoors, because only in this quiet moment can Indians live like themselves. The synopsis on the back cover, as you can see here on the left-hand side, refers to Adela Quest's wish to see India and her accusation of Aziz, to illustrate that the novel captures the conflict between the British colonizers and the educated Indians. It points out the novel reveals different forms of identity crisis represented by the Eurasian driver, Mr. Harris, in the car accident. The synopsis quotes his rumination. When English and Indians were both present, he grew self-conscious because he did not know to whom he belonged. The synopsis ends with another quote. Beyond the sky must not there be something that overarches all the skies, more impartial even than they, and suggests that the essence of the novel is about links between binaries, about something that straddles and governs opposites. While the translation of this quote is mostly correct, taking the line out of context suggests misunderstanding. The quote is actually from midpoint at the bridge party, when the English are bored and the conversation becomes vague and abstract before they start speaking about Cousin Kate. The book's belly band, as you can see, gives some bullet points of the novel as one of the literary classics. This is the last novel by the great I.E.M.F. It's the winner of the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. It's recommended by Professor Lai from NTNU. The film adaptation was by the great director David Lean. Also two other quotes. One, a description of the Punkawala's magnificent body in the court scene. The other, a one-liner blurb, which, if translated back to English, is, in addition to respect, we only hope for equality. One final paratext is a YouTube promo for the novel. The publisher commissions Luo Yijun, a renowned Taiwanese writer, to make an introductory clip. Luo spoke about how, when he was in his 20s, he was first introduced to the novel, alongside his reading of Proust, Woolf, Joyce, etc. Forster provides an insightful portrayal of interactions between races, religions, classes, and nations. And the novel is, I quote, an early 20th century modernist classic. Its depiction of conflict and confusion, anticipating later post-colonial works by Rushdie and Naipaul. Okay, so this translation, this new translation for a Forster scholar, is a very confused and confusing product. Overall, the translation seemed to attempt to optimize the novel's relevance to 21st century readers in Taiwan, but it's unsure which aspect to highlight and which direction to take. So far, we've seen emphases, respectively, on the novel's classic status alongside other Western canons, on the novel as a prescient post-colonial intervention into the political conflict between colonizer and colonized, on the novel's postmodern exploration of identity politics and issues of belongingness. But accompanying these emphases is an essentialist understanding of India. The cover design is an example. The curves and floral patterns can be seen as an attempt to conjure up an oriental imaginary of the book setting, a visual cue of a Taiwanese perception of the Indian. Also, the mistranslated quote on the front cover characterizes Indian people as poetic and elegiac, their true self forced to remain hidden from the British. Is this exoticization a strategy of drawing sympathy from Taiwanese readers who are aware of the colonization of their island in the past 500 years? And the use of this mistranslated quote in such a conspicuous place prompts us to question the reliability of the foreword provided by Lai. Yes, the translation is very readable, but in its more idiomatic storytelling, does it really tell the original story? So it's very tempting to go to the publisher or track down the translator, requesting to interview them about the production process of the translation, asking how this new translation was commissioned, why they deemed that there would be a market, how the translator and the editor worked, and how they decided on which campaigns to run. But I also wonder whether this kind of research would be effective. While it would be possible to obtain key information surrounding the translation, publication, and dissemination of the book, what this translation reflects, I suggest, is not so much the intention of those individual translation players as the social and historical cause of events that shaped the translation. That is, what underpins the translation is a perception of a passage to India as available to be made to speak to a target audience, which in turn reveals an imaginary of the target audience, which ultimately reveals an imaginary of Taiwan in the 21st century. Another context is very interesting. The curricula of the teaching of Anglophone literature in Taiwan show that in the last 10 years, a passage to India has actually been less taught. This new translation then seems a marker of the domestication of Forster's novel in Taiwan, the text moving from inside academia to outside, becoming more stylistically accessible in the process. The issues the novel addresses, as the new translation painstakingly points out, are many and discrete. On the one hand, the Taiwanese readers in 2017, amidst ongoing domestic and international ideological debates and uncertainties while seeing everyday legacies led by various colonizers, might wish to find their sense of identity crisis, if a crisis there really was, being touched upon by a work 100 years ago. On the other hand, that labels such as classic, award, India were perceived to be able to hold sway over Taiwanese readers in 2017, that literary works from the West continue to suggest a cultural status, that translation sells better in Taiwan than local publications. All these reflect the power relations between the foreign and the domestic. Ultimately, the translation is a commercial enterprise. Through its commercialization, a text is made to multitask, and through its multitasking, the translation bears traces indicative of the negotiations and forces inside Taiwan's literary marketplace. Also, these traces epitomize how Taiwan is also multitasking, dealing with its past, present, and future simultaneously. Consequently, for better or for worse, this translation very much presents a different passage to another India. Thank you very much.
May I now invite Professor Krzysztof Fordoński.
So we had a paper without PowerPoint, we had a paper with a PowerPoint, now we will have a presentation without a paper. PowerPoint is where all my notes are. So this is a presentation of a project which is undergoing, and it is a project which is a mission impossible, but sadly without the main actor. Because it's a project which requires knowledge of 30 languages and access to materials in 30 languages in, I think, 5 different ways of writing, some of which are not alphabets. And so this is rather an appeal to you present here and to those who might watch it at a later time, to start a new path of research, to seek the reception of a passage to India, and in some cases in some countries where there is very little material, the reception of E.M.F. Forster in local languages, in translation. So what I'm going to do will be to show you how varied, how complex, how sometimes peculiar the reception of a passage to India via translation has been so far, and to open the floor to all of you to go back home and start seeking more information, perhaps more translations, because I do not claim to have found them all. Okay, so the history of translations of a passage to India is almost as long as the history of a passage to India itself, because it starts in 1925, so next year we shall be celebrating. Perhaps some translation scholar will throw a conference, the Centenary of a passage to India in translations. And it all began with Sweden, of all possible places, and probably one can guess why, because a passage to India was from very early on recognized as a candidate for a Nobel Prize, and the way to get a Nobel Prize is to be available in Swedish, or available to the members of the Swedish Royal Academy. So it was within a year of the original publication that Tora Ram Eriksson published the Swedish translation, and this Swedish translation has been in circulation ever since. The bit of a problem which I actually discovered fairly late on, she got married having completed the translation, and from some point on, probably 1944 edition, she republished the book under her married name. So some sources claim that there are 2 Swedish translations, but actually there is only one with 2 different names. And another peculiar aspect, this translation was the first one to be published in more than one country, because in most cases, one language means one country, but Swedish is an exception. It is also spoken in Finland. And in 1944, in the middle of the war, with Finland being on the wrong side of the war, by the way, a Finnish edition appeared, published by publisher Schilds in Helsinki. The most recent edition I found was 1985, so it's been out of print for almost 40 years. The second edition, merely a year later, was Czech edition, and this is the dust cover of the first Czech edition, Cesta do Indie. Karel Kraus translated Passage to India into Czech. This translation was never republished, and it was replaced exactly 50 years ago, so on the 50th anniversary of the original publication, by a new edition by Josef Schwarz, and this has been most recently republished in 2008. And then the first Russian edition came about, one out of 3, as you can see. My system is here, to make it clear. I combined them by languages, so you have all the translations on one panel, with usually the first edition shown as the illustration. So the first Russian translation, 1926. Ms. Nekrasova was the author of the translation. Unfortunately, she paid with her life for the translation. In 1937, she was accused of being an American and English spy, and as a proof of her spying activities, her correspondence with writers and publishers was submitted to the Court of Justice. She was sent to a gulag, and then in the winter of 1941, she died. And as her biographer claims, when the war broke out, when Germany attacked Soviet Russia, they simply stopped feeding the inmates. So she died of hunger. The second edition came out in 1937, and I haven't been able to find anything about it. Both of them are very rare according to Russian scholars. So very recently, 7 years ago, a completely new translation came out with a slightly different title. The most recent title is the closest to the original. Поездка в India is something like an excursion to India. So it's a diminishing of the original title. And then a more famous translation, the one and only French translation so far by Charles Moron, Route des Indes, first published 1927 and then repeatedly republished. Most recent edition I found was 2013, but I'm guessing there are more recent ones. The book is still in press. The Finns got their first edition 1928, and it has been in circulation ever since. The most recent edition is 2007. I haven't been able to find the original cover, so I chose one, very typical one, because about 1984, 1985, the old translations were brought back with new covers using the posters or stills from the movie, capitalizing on the movie. Germans had to wait until 1932. Paul IV published the first edition. I haven't been able to find the cover. So this is a 1980s, typically 1980s cover of the second translation by Wolfgang von Einsiedel. The first translation was published 1932, republished 1936, then disappeared completely, but it was republished in 1950 after the Second World War. But then Frankfurt publisher Fischer ordered a new translation, which has been republished again and again, and it is the only translation to be published in 4 countries. There is a German, East German, Austrian, and Swiss edition. The Danes translated Passage to India twice. The first edition was 1935. This is not the dust cover. This is the cover. So it's probably the same design for all the books published by Berlingske Forlag. There used to be a dust cover, but most of these dust covers simply disappeared over time. The second edition, 85, republished once and probably not available since. And then my specialty, Polish edition, 1938. Forster gave the translator the rights to stop the lady from asking his hand in marriage. The details are in the book, which should be circulating somewhere here. Never republished. It is a fairly bad translation, so I understand why it was never republished. But in 1979, to commemorate Forster's centenary, a new edition was commissioned, and this edition has been in print ever since. The most recent reissue was 2017. Hungarians got their Passage to India in 1941. This edition was published on, and this is the original dust cover. And then in 1980, a new edition came about. Arpad Günz prepared a new edition, and Arpad Günz, 10 years later, became the first president of the Republic of Hungary. So it's not guaranteed that you end up in a concentration camp after translating a passage. You may become a president. You just have to be lucky. And this edition has been republished at least once. As one might guess, it's rather obvious that Forster was not published in Italy during the Mussolini regime, but just as soon as the Mussolini regime ended, a translation came about in 1945, a translation by Augusto Guidi, which was replaced 17 years later by a translation by Adriana Motti. And this translation has been republished several times over. Most recently, 1980, but I believe there are more recent editions. Croatians joined in the club in 1947. Jaksa Sedmak produced the first translation, which was published twice, and then in the 21st century, a new translation by Zlatko Crnkovic came out also republished once. The cover is of the first translation. Slovaks have only one edition, 1949. As the translator informed in the preface, it was meant to commemorate Forster's 70th birthday, and at the same time it was to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the book's publication. The Portuguese have much more of options. There are 4 translations. The first, the earliest, 1949, so also the 25th anniversary. It has a rather strange title, Umoru dos Cinco Dedos, which means a 5-fingered hill. The translator, those early translations sometimes take liberties with the title. The 3 other translations, the titles are more or less equivalent of A Passage to India. All of them, as far as I know, were made in Brazil. There is no continental Portuguese translation. The Brazilians were much more interested in Forster. The Dutch joined 1950, the Eughof van de Marabar, so again, rather free rendering of the original title. In 1985, a new translation appeared, Overtocht naar India, closer to the original. Unfortunately, I have been defeated by various scripts, so I don't have the Japanese covers, but there are 2 translations. The first, 1952, and then from 1970, translated by Yuta Kaseo, has been regularly reprinted. Slovenians, 1953, only one translation, only one edition, Popotovanie v Indio by Janez Gradisnik. Judging by the number of copies I found in online bookstores, it was fairly big printing, and it's still available. The Spanish have 3 translations. The first one is Argentinian. Under Franco, Forster was probably not very much welcome in Spain, so the first translation, 1955, and this is the cover, El Paso a la India, is by an Argentinian writer and translator, published in Buenos Aires. Then in 1981, the first Spanish translation appeared, and it has been regularly reprinted. And then in 2004, a Colombian writer was invited to translate for a Barcelona-based publisher, and he produced a new translation. And this is one of the few examples where these translations were actually subject of some scholarly scrutiny, because there is a paper about the Spanish translations, one of very, very few interest in the topic. And Arabic translation is something of a mystery to me, because I don't read or write Arabic, which means the best I could find is that there is one translation by Ismail Izaldin, which has been published first in Cairo, in Egypt, then it was republished in Damascus, then it was republished in Beirut, and then by a publisher that I have not been able to trace. I found it on a German website selling Arabic books. So there is a cover, you can see it, but where the publication took place, I cannot tell. Only the first and the fourth editions are with the name of the translator. My guess is that this is the same translation, but I have not been able to confirm this. Norwegians joined in the same year. The cover is of the second edition. Peter Magnus, the same translation was published twice. The Turks were much more ambitious. There are 3 translations. The cover is of the very first edition from 1961, but there have been 2 more, and Iletişim publications have published all the works of E.M.F. Forster. They have a full collection, and they regularly bring out new printings, the most recent just 2 years ago. Bulgarians, Nagosti v India by Nadia Sotirova, only one edition in 1967. Persian, I only found this in Kirkpatrick, no cover. The Chinese have been just discussed, so we can proceed from that. Apart from the Taiwanese publications, there is one mainland China edition from 2003. Romanian translation came out in 1977. Liliana Pamphil Todorianu, republished by the same publisher after 30 years, and then in 2014, most recently, by another publisher. There is a Hebrew translation. Again, the Hebrew alphabet beat me. I couldn't find it. There is a Bengali translation by Rabbi Shekhar Sengupta. I have just found today from the book which is circulating somewhere that there are 2 Bengali translations. But I know now, so I will correct it when I write an essay about it. There has been no Hindu translations, and I exchanged some letters with Professor Trivedi about it. He told me that he asked for permission to translate the book in the 1980s, but he was refused. The copyright agency simply refused to sell the right for translation into Hindu. Allegedly, there might be Urdu translation, but no one has seen it. Korea has 2 translations. My guess is that the title is the same in both. It's just that different people were doing the transliteration from Korean. One 1986, one 1997. There are also 2 Greek translations, one from 1989 and one from 2007. And we are coming to an end. Lithuanian in the year 2000. The cover is of the 2nd edition, because the first came out as a double volume with a Where Angels Fear to Tread. It was only in 2006 that a passage in there was published as a separate volume, so I used the cover design of this edition. And the most recent one, Estonian translation from the year 2008, and here is the cover. And this is it as far as I know, but I'm guessing that the Centenary should bring some more translations, or at least some new editions. But it's very difficult to track down translation. If you don't know the title of the translation, then you don't know what to Google, to put it very simply. And I'm just going through National Library's websites, just looking what they have of Forster. So there might be more, but 30 languages so far, at least 56 translations, probably more. Thank you.
Thanks to all colleagues for adhering to time very well. Perhaps if I could invite the panelists to return to the front of the podium, and we still have upwards of 20 some odd minutes to engage in thoughtful conversation after the inspiring papers. Thank you. Can we see you behind the...
Yeah, just move slightly to the back.
Great. Perhaps I was inspired in multiple directions by the 3 papers, but perhaps I could open the floor to begin, since I'm tired of my own voice. I invite questions. Again, just a quick summary overview. Professor Ratna Raman was framing sacred literatures in the context of exclusionary practices of religion. Dr. Tsung-Han gave us a fascinating reading of the ideological self-positioning of the lead translation from 2017, which clear thesis, confused and confusing products. Very interesting framing. On the one hand, the most recent translation was, to quote Dr. Tsai, more colloquial, involved greater adherence to storytelling values, and provided the best detail. And yet, at some level, as that interesting exercise in back translation indicated, right, how far, truthfully, the Chinese translation had strayed from the text. And then, wow, what a tremendous project Krzysztof is undertaking, asking for our help, literally, to crowdsource and globalize, track down the living state of play, not only of obviously of the older translations, how do we find them, source them, locate them, but also the afterlife of Forster's translation. You know, the artifact, we're all here today, the artifact is very much alive and will continue to be translated moving forward. So it's not only a retrospective exercise, but very much a prospective one as well. So again, that's just my quick overview of the three papers, but may I please invite, we've all come so far. Yes, please. We have a question from the floor.
Thank you very much for all those three very inspiring papers. As some of you know, I'm crazy about translation, so my questions will go to men. Out of curiosity, is this Taiwanese translation leaning towards domestication, clearly, right? Is it something outstanding, or is it the convention of translating literature right now in Taiwan?
Thank you very much. I'm not entirely sure whether that would be regarded as a convention, but at the same time, I do think that nowadays in Taiwan, we have the publishers are noticing this particular kind of space for more and more canonical literature or canonical literary text to be introduced to Taiwanese audience. So this process of domestication definitely happens more and more frequently among all different kinds of texts. They have been retranslated, they have been adopted into different forms, and as I said in my paper today, most of them nowadays, when they are republished or retranslated, they are usually made into more idiomatic Chinese. They are usually made more readable in a sense.
That's kind of interesting. I don't know, Krzysztof, if you agree with me, but in many Western countries, it's the opposite direction, right? It's more, okay, maybe linguistically we would still domesticate, but this foreigners would be introduced into translation. So that's how the Taiwanese want to just capitalize on readability, right?
It's fascinating because I think if you really want to care about, for example, what I said, style and language, and if you want to translate Forster's text more literally, you would definitely end up coming up with some slightly confusing sentences, because Forster is very into using it and you.
As you demonstrated,
in
so
the
it's
text.
Clarification all the time.
Exactly.
If you want to use Raman's terminology, right?
Yeah. So Forster's succinctness in his sentences. Sometimes, if you want to recreate it, it would be difficult for Chinese readers to understand. The earliest Chinese translation definitely tries to do that. For a reader who reads the original English text first, I actually find the earliest translation very elegant. The sentence has that kind of particular cadence in its original form. But to be honest, if you don't know anything about the English original text, that particular translation would be quite baffling.
And does that happen also with culture-related items? Is that also domesticated? I would assume no, but...
Probably no, because at the same time, the story that this new translation is still trying to tell is definitely the conflict between the colonizer and the colonized.
Exactly.
And
So
it seems to me that the publisher wants to capitalize on that to try to evoke Chinese readers' sympathy with something that they might be able to relate to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
Krzysztof, I was struck by the number of re-editions of the French translation, and there is only one. So have you, by any chance, compared them? Okay, no. But
I have an answer. There is a chapter in the book which is circulating around the room about the French translation.
all right.
So all your questions have been answered.
All right, I'll shut up.
Yes, please, we have a question. The gentleman in the fifth row. Thank you.
David.
Hi, David. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, everybody. First of all, Krzysztof, there is a new Arabic translation by Mohammed Shaheen, 2021 or 2022. I have a copy, not here sadly, but I don't read Arabic either, so I can't sort of tell you about it. But it looks very beautiful. I was very interested in that survey against Tsung-Han's paper as well, because we talked about the paratexts. Because first of all, you have these variant titles in some languages, which is also very interesting. I mean, the Spanish, for instance, I mean, 2 or 3 versions. And the images that are sometimes used on the covers as well. So I don't really have a question. I'm just kind of excited in a way about the possibility of research in that area of the paratext in the history of the reception through translation of the novel. I mean, I wonder if either of you has anything would like to comment on that.
Well, I am limited by the languages that I can read. So I have done a little bit of this when I wrote about the reception of A Passage to India in so-called Soviet bloc, which for the book which is unsurprisingly circulating around the room. So then I found introductions written for the GDR edition. I found the introduction to the Slovak edition. I found the introductions to the Czech edition, obviously. There are no introductions to Polish editions. There are just blurbs on the back cover. And my theory is that the more liberal a country was, the less the need for kind of establishing a context. Because the GDR, the Soviet Socialist Germany edition, is very lengthy, and it paints a very clear picture that Forster does not really understand India as Karl Marx did, and his presentation is consequently marred by his misunderstanding. I'm serious. I'm just quoting from memory, but not very far from Leisure. While in Polish, this is just the book tells about a conflict between colonizer and colonizers, without going into detail. So yes, it is interesting, and I know that some of the edition, like the 1945 edition, Italian translation, has a preface, but I haven't been able to found it. I'm going to Italy in a month, so I hope maybe it is somewhere to be bought. Just to kind of to induce you to this part of research, usually these editions are very cheap. I bought a copy of the first Czech edition with the dust cover for the equivalent of 15 euros, including postage from the Czech Republic. So it's not any getting the original first editions is a massive investment, but getting the translated first editions is peanuts.
Thank you. I have a question for Ratna, if I may, just to look forward to your voice. I was really struck by the detail of your analysis, the studiousness with which Forster's narrative avoids representations of women. And yet, quite obviously, because of his own nascent sexual politics, Forster was someone who was deeply committed to diversity and inclusion. So how, I'm just wondering, do you square this tension between the absence of connection with women in the novel and maybe the wider frame that Forster uses? I was thinking back to Professor Trivedi's paper. He scales up to the cosmological to be cohesive, or to aim for cohesion in a way that, as you pointed out rightly, his gender politics don't really, at least with women, don't allow for. And I think that accounts maybe for some of the veering or the energy that Professor Trivedi was alluding to. So would you care to, he doesn't connect with women, but he's using cosmology to get around the problem of the divisions of religion in the attempt to integrate. And so how do you square that tension, please?
I was just thinking while you were speaking about this poem written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This is Aurora Lake, in which she creates this cosmos where, it's not God and Adam, but there's a goddess. And the whole notion of the female body as, physiologically and physically providing nourishment and sustenance is something that she uses.
Right.
And she's creating this image in a patriarchal world where, women don't even have the space to work with poetry. For instance, they say that, if you don't learn the classical languages, you don't write poetry. And she manages because she has a bad back and she has an indulgent father, so she gets scholars to come home and teach her the Latin and the Greek, as it were. But going back to the Forsterian narrative, other than the fact that Forster had a very different sexual preference, he, for instance, had an aunt who left him money, which allowed him this life of privilege.
Sure.
So I find it very difficult to see why there is no woman in a position of power. So why is it that the only two women that people can be spoken about? We talk about how there is a lot of comment about how Forster stereotypes the Indian characters. I don't find the Indian characters stereotyped. They become stereotyped now, 100 years later. So he probably gives you prototypes of the eccentric Hindu, for instance, or the emotional Muslim. These are the two prototypes which have now become stereotypes. And of course now the emotional Indian itself is another narrative. While we talk of the stiff British upper lip, and this is just a small point I want to make, which I couldn't fit into my paper. We talk about the Oriental inability to respect privacy. So we have an instance of that where Aziz comes in at Mao and begins to read letters that were not addressed to him. But the interesting thing is, what is McBride doing? What is everyone else doing? So it's not as if the British are so different, or the white men are so different. And this is why it puzzles me, because I think that Forster picks up stereotypes about women from the 19th century and is not really able to work his way through them. And this was the century then, and to my mind, Forster is very 19th century, even though the novel is written in the 1920s, and that is part of my, complete fascination with this novel, because I think it's the greatest novel that has been written about India, and I would recommend it on university curriculum all over the world, as a matter of fact. But Forster is still very 19th century, because the 19th century is still trying to find out what to make of its women. Do we treat them as infants? Do we infantilize them? Do we control them? Do we give them any rights at all? And somewhere inside his head, those connections haven't been made. Also, today in the 21st century, that there are men who are intimidated by strong, articulate women. So why should it surprise us if Forster, sort of functioned in the same manner? Only human after all, despite this incredible imagination and vision. And the saddest thing is you have Adela Quested, who is quickly defined as a prig. So, if Adela Quested had been a man, and if Adela Quested had come up in court and made a statement like this, when she recants, it would have been a very different space.
All right.
She's not given that because it's a female persona. This is my theory, of course.
Now,
would it be possible for me to kind of answer that?
Sorry.
You have to. Sorry. Thank you.
And Forster was also a great pal of the Bloomsbury group. So he knew these two sisters.
Exactly.
One was a painter, the other one was a writer.
Yeah.
Why is none of that filtering?
I was so very inspired by your paper, because when teaching Forster's gender politics, especially his representations of women, are nowadays what I find most difficult to navigate through class discussions, especially for nowadays women students in class. They have very strong ideas about why women always represented by Forster in stereotypical terms. They are not really given space to talk about themselves, not really into their feelings, and also, especially for those aunt figures, they are usually being laughed at, they're being made fun of. So nowadays, it's just an observation in my own experience. When teaching Forster, Forster's gender stereotypes is slightly difficult to kind of maneuver around. Yeah.
If I could just supplement, I think we can set ourselves up for a lovely luncheon. Yeah, I mean, I could debate the point. When I teach Margaret Schlegel in Howard's End, and the energy with which Margaret conducts herself, I see the stereotyping. But I think Forster goes some distance, at least with Margaret, in trying to open up a range of possibilities. But the kind of occulted absence of the woman in India, in the Indian space, is quite remarkable. But there's two elements I think that I would love when you get around to writing the paper, Ratna, to think about, is the ways in which S.M.S. Moore becomes occulted.
Absolutely.
So that's energy of a sort. It's not a modern historical woman, but she's still being worshipped in all the problematic ways, right? But the ways in which the eternal feminine
Go back to the cosmic mother.
is still Forster's leveraging that, maybe precisely because he doesn't know how to talk about a historical woman or a historical Indian woman, number one. Number two, that very powerful, I just reread it recently thinking about the conference, when you have, I forget the chapter number, one of you will remind me, when you have Mrs. Derrick and Mrs. McBride pulling, with their magnifying glasses, pulling the cactus.
End of the Maradha.
Yeah, pulling the cactus thorns out of Adela's body. And this is actually a reference which is very similar to an equivalent passage in Alexander, The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope, where precisely because you can't get into a woman's head, you're very fascinated with her surfaces. So again, those are not his modern women per se, but they are Forster beginning to deal with the occultedness of the feminine and the surface of the feminine. I think so, but very much agree. He's embarking upon a process, but he doesn't really know where to go. But I'm very interested that Alexander Pope finds its way into Adela's, the representation of her skin. Very interested that Miss Moore, instead of being historical, does have a kind of space in the cosmos. I think those are his feints, or his attempts to get at something. Sorry, I think we still have a little bit of time. I promised colleagues that we had a little extra time. I think we still have about 5 minutes. But please, more questions. You've heard enough from me already, I'm sure. More questions from the audience, please. Yes, please. If you would kindly introduce yourselves so that we can learn who you are.
Hi, my name is Xingyi, and I have a question for Dr. Tsai. Thank you so much for your very fascinating presentation. I find the part about paratext really, really interesting. And I'm not sure if my understanding is correct, but I feel like there is a tension between and sort of overemphasis on the canonical status of a passage to India. It's like almost the publishing house is claiming that this is a classic and you must buy it. But then there's also, on the other hand, there's kind of this effort to amplify the marginalized voices, for example, the thoughts of the Eurasian, and how like Taiwanese people, they may identify themselves with like the ordinary Indian people. So my question is kind of related to that, because you just said that this translation, these different versions of translation are a kind of imaginary of the target audience and also Taiwan in 20th century. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about the afterlife of these different versions of translation. For example, what is the response, like is this imaginary really working? For example, what is the response from the public and from the academia in the form of sales data, for example, or like book reviews or like journal articles? And also, how do we kind of negotiate that love-hate relationship between the pressure to sell the book and also this endeavor to build a collective national intellectual life? Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for the wonderful question, and you have provided me with so many different directions for me to further my research, but I have to say I have no idea about its sales or its responses, etc., or how it has been reviewed. One thing that I might mention is that since it got that particular forward by Professor Lai from NTNU, it sort of kind of secured a certain kind of academic approval among academia. But at the same time, as I said, Professor Lai said that it has been the most readable text, and it has fewer mistranslations. But apparently, even on this front cover, there's such a mistranslated particular quote. So I don't really know how much I can trust Professor Lai anymore about her forward.
Damning with faint praise.
Yeah,
There's
so
less mistranslations.
back to your kind of original kind of starting point of your question, I do absolutely agree with the tension that you mentioned. On the one hand, the translation has repeatedly, again and again, focusing on the canonical status of Forster's work. On the other hand, it says that his story is about marginalized voices that people in Taiwan might be able to identify with. And this kind of tension between putting it on a pedestal and disseminating it more widely, I think has been ongoing in Taiwan. And kind of just like a side note, the publisher who published this new translation recently, they collaborated with a very popular bread branch in Taiwan, selling a new series of bread called Chewing Classics. And on the pack of all of their bread products is a quote, for example, from The Wasteland, or from Mrs. Dalloway, or from A Passage to India. So they are suggesting that, when you feel hungry and when you go to one of our convenience stores and buy a bread, you can read before you start eating the bread. So once again, this particular kind of tension between reading something canonical to improve yourself and consuming something quite ordinary
Literally.
is just everywhere in Taiwan.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Let's give a round of applause for our wonderful thank you better way to begin the conference. So please, we can now move directly into our next session, which is very most exciting, 1:30 presentation of the new critical edition of E.M. Forster's novels. So thank you very much.
Shall I sit? Yes, so you're close to the computer, you've got the slides. Yeah. What shall I sit in this one? Yes, want to go there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can move the camera, so no problem. Oh, great. Okay, you are just in the middle.
That's fine, but how it will start, so I won't read that until just a minute. Yeah. I'll do that. You go. Just go. Okay, I've been delegated to start by Professor Scourfield, and I'm delighted to do so. So it's wonderful to be here and to be able to give more an update rather than a presentation on the final edition, and just to mention a few things. I think inevitably in a brief presentation like this, it will be more than anything what you want to ask us really about the form that it will take. And really what we're doing in the Cambridge edition of the fiction of E.M. Forster is to represent the fiction, so that's the novels and the short stories and fragments, in line with 21st century editorial practice, which differs from that of the Abinger edition, which was started in the early 1970s, which is before a major shift in modernist editing practice. The old practice, which is in line with authorial intention over the stress on texts, was to emphasize the final text that was produced in an author's lifetime,
And modern editing practice prioritizes the text and context, prioritizes, as we are doing, the published text, the first published edition. The edition entered circulation in 1924 in the case of A Passage to India. Well, just to mention a few of the things that we're doing in terms of what the edition looks like. We are, as I say, going for the copy text, as it's called in editing circles, is based on the first edition. Qualification there necessary about Morris, which I'll come on to. And what we're also doing is presenting all the extant manuscript material, which is very important. The Avenger edition didn't always do this. So, for example, one of the earliest volumes in the edition to appear, Where Angels Fear to Tread, will for the first time include all the extant manuscript material of that novel. And as we worked on the edition, the group of us involved, we've very much come to stress what I often refer to as readability. In other words, that when we go to this manuscript material, we will be able to readily access what is on the page. We won't have to work through multiple brackets within brackets within brackets, which makes manuscript material in the Avenger quite hard to read through, to actually read and experience these texts as reading texts. And I, for one, regard the kind of work that we've been doing, one of the revelatory moments, for example, was reading the manuscript material of A Passage to India, and not A Passage to India, of A Room with a View, and being the so-called Lucy novels in the Avenger edition, and being actually able to read that material as a text rather than something where I could go to a few sentences or a paragraph and try and bring off the page in its form in the Avenger edition. Actually, the experience of reading it as a literary text, readability. I think just to mention a few things that we've already feel that we are discovering. One is the care and craft which Forster brought to his writing. When we look at the insertions and the deletions, we see Forster honing and really thinking about the weighting of the phrase, the selection of a particular word. Any sense that Forster is some kind of well-off dilettante in the world of letters could not be further from the truth. These are very carefully worked texts. He was a very hard-working writer. The amount of care we see. We don't have very extensive manuscript survivals, but where we do have full manuscripts, where we do have manuscript material, it's extraordinary to see the care and the level of detailed engagement that is captured in those manuscripts. And we also see, I think this is a story that's not really been fully told before, the extent to which he was interested in engaging with publishers, with the kind of deal he got, and also with a prospective readership. Interestingly, he was most concerned in the early stages of a book's appearance. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that once a book was published, he felt it had its own life, and he would comment on what he thought he was doing at the time, but would actually be very interested to hear about readings that what people had found in the text at a later date. He's not a writer who wanted to stay in control of his texts decades after they had first appeared. It is the Italian novels which will appear first in the edition. Work on those is very nearly complete. and that will include this, I think, very exciting readable text of what we're calling the Lucy texts rather than the Lucy novels, because they're not complete novels. That's the manuscript material of A Room with a View, and also some very interesting contextual work on Forster's engagement with San Gimignano, which is the basis of Monteriano in Where Angels Fear to Tread. A number of archive visits there, and we actually know much more, I think, about Forster's source material for what he heard about, read about San Gimignano. Quite a tale finding the book and the text there, which turned out, the only copy written turned out to be in Manchester, so it had been in my university library all along. It's the nature of such archive work. In the recorded talks for the conference, there is a paper which I very much recommend by Chris Morant, who's the textual editor of A Passage to India, the subject of our conference. And he is doing the text work, writing the introduction, and the extensive explanatory notes, which Passage to India, like all the books in the edition, will feature. They are being undertaken by Harish Trivedi, who we heard from at the start of the conference. Paul B. Armstrong, distinguished Forster scholar, is well on the way with Howard's End. She hopes to have finished by spring next year, and it falls to me to edit Morris, which will contain all three versions. So it will actually be a very big book, as will A Passage to India, which will contain the full manuscript version as well as the copy text based on 1924. So the edition of Morris will contain all three versions. I have missed out one of Forster's novels, but that's because David will speak about it now. Forster's own favourite amongst his novels, of course, The Longest Journey. David.
Yes, thanks, Howard. I'm not sure if this one's working. Is it working right? So
yes.
Right. Yes, so it falls to me to edit what I like to say to people is the one you haven't read. Wouldn't be true of anybody here, but in many conferences, you know, The Longest Journey, which one is that? What's that about? That's the one that hasn't been filmed, and so on. And it's being an interesting process. It's proving itself very interesting in a number of ways. To give you a couple of examples, the first edition, as you'll all know, was published in 1907. I've been looking at the first US edition, which we're also taking into account, and that only came out in 1922, and of course, I mean, a war intervened, but it does suggest that Forster's interest in Forster on the other side of the Atlantic was relatively slow to develop, and perhaps naturally with that particular novel, which is so very, very English. Some interesting things emerging there. The American novel, which I did purchase, not as cheaply as the Czech translation of A Passage to India. It cost me about $200. Very beautifully produced by Knopf. It's wonderfully bound. The quality of the paper is not so good, but what's interesting is the number of typographical errors in it. And this is not insignificant because it's plainly the edition which they used for the Gutenberg, which we all go to when we want to do word searches. So there's quite a lot to kind of put right there. I also have the sense, and it's no more than that at this stage, that different compositors were used, because in some parts of the novel you'll go through several pages and not find a single deviation from the first English edition, and then all of a sudden there'll be a spate, and one can only think it was somebody less careless or the same person who was nodding off at the end of the day. But there's something to do with process anyway that I think we can find out a little bit about. there's going to be an awful lot to say at the explanatory note level as well, and I think this is an area where, as Howard knows, I have a particular interest, because I think readers do need a lot of help with certain explanations, say about Cambridge and the language in which Cambridge was described in the Edwardian period. So there's plenty to do there. The manuscript. The manuscript. Well, we do have a manuscript, and it's 600 pages, more or less. There are many corrections. There's a lot of material that was jettisoned that is still there. Forster used the backs of pages he'd rejected. Anyway, it's a complete mess. And we know this already from the Avenger, where Elizabeth Heine did a great job back in the 70s. But her edition is very, very rebarbative. Howard was talking about brackets, angle brackets, square brackets, curly brackets, all kinds of brackets within brackets. It's kind of impossible to use. So we're going to try and make it much more readable. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to emerge from the manuscript itself. And I thought, since we were doing this, that you might like to see a few pages from the manuscript of The Longest Journey. So that's what I've asked Anna to put on the computer here. So if I can get this to work.
Double click.
Double click. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, is that it? Yeah. So there we are. Forster's hand in 1907 was a lot clearer than it was in 1924, and so Chris Morant, Howard mentioned, that has some difficult and quite interesting work to do on separating, I mean, as he put in the his little video, could from wood. How do you identify could from wood given Forster's hand? And there are ways of doing it, as you'll see. It's much clearer in 1907 with The Longest Journey. Do I have to go back now?
You can click on this arrow which appears on the side of the screen. I think they should move to the next.
Okay. Can you see? Oh yeah. Great. So, is that sort of clear? Can I enlarge that at all? It's probably all right, is it? So this is from the first chapter, and I thought you might like to see it because, well, my talk later on at the conference is partly about names in Forster, and it was something that he agonized about now and again. So Herbert in The Longest Journey was originally, you see at the very top of the page there, originally called Jack, and you can see how he's amended that where Jack is where Herbert is, and a little below that, about the 6th line. So do we call Ricky Elliott the hero of the novel, or what do we call him? Whatever he is, he's Ricky, but he's originally Gustav. And I'll be doing some research not yet done on that, the choice of Gustav, which I think was quite, well, surprising. And you can see there how he, just in general, how he deletes, he tries things, he adds things. No, I don't like that either, crosses that out, sometimes reverts to his first shot, sometimes puts in another one. That's very typical. This is a good page. So you can guess what some of it's going to be like. And yeah, this one from chapter 12, and importantly, Stephen is originally called Harold. It's about 7 lines up. Harold has been deleted and Stephen added. And the other thing is that if you remember, as I'm sure you all do remember, how chapter 12 starts, it's not like that. There's an additional sentence that he obviously put in at proof stage or a TypeScript stage. Quite a lot of
ongoing work that you can see by looking at the manuscript itself and comparing the manuscript to the published edition. We don't have any of the proofs, unfortunately. It's a great gap. It would have told us a lot. We don't have them. The switch from Harold to Stephen is particularly significant because there's a whole deleted chapter about Harold, which was a name he'd used already in Albergo Empedocle, for instance, and what the reason was for the change, well, I haven't yet discovered. This is the first page of the deleted chapter 14, which follows the ride that Ricky and Stephen take to Salisbury. And a whole lot of it was sliced out, including quite a large part of a later chapter, or rather later chapter was originally 2 chapters, later amalgamated into one. That's nice and clear. Unfortunately, it's not part of the novel as we have it, so there's not much we can do with it. But it will all appear, as Howard was saying, in the edition as additional material, and it will be much more attuned to the reader's needs than the Elizabeth Heine, where it's all mixed up with the notes at the back, and it's not really very helpful. So that's just to give you an idea. It's causing me some sleepless nights. I mean, what is that? But it's actually great fun, and you do get a sense of Forster actually writing the thing and thinking about it as he does so, and that's. I think he must have had sleepless nights as well in the process of composition. So that is, as a professor of mine once said at the end of a lecture, which he finished 20 minutes early, that is all I have to say.
Perhaps you have 5 minutes for questions. I know
Yes.
lunch is calling, but
Lunch is at 2, so yeah.
yeah, so it's around 5
for questions, 5 for
We need 5 minutes to get there.
Yeah, okay. So do you agree 5 minutes or yeah?
Yeah, 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah. So I mean, we may have none, in which case we will have
There is Claire was fast.
Oh, there she is.
Hi, I hope this works. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I'm Professor Claire Monk. If you get up in time tomorrow, you have to listen to me wittering on about the other boat. Yeah, I have 2 questions. When are the editions being published? And is there any digital hypertext element to this, or is it going to be purely print?
Yes, well, they'll appear when they're finished. I think the first one to appear will be next year, and will be a room with a view.
There's an incredible appetite online. I mean, I keep reading posts where people online now think that they can see all the Morris manuscripts free on the internet. So I think there are some desperate people waiting for Howard's volume on Morris.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that to me was the second part of it, which will answer the kind of the accessibility side. One of the things that is driving what one might call the modernist editions industry, why there are so many of these, the Henry James is in process, Ginny Wolfe is in process, the Forster is close to starting to publish, is because of the fact that these will, yes, be print books, but they will also be sold and made available in electronic format, which will be much more accessible. Now that leads to a further question, doesn't it, about the platforms that the presses use and what these look like. Now my understanding is that Cambridge University Press at present take a fairly kind of traditional view in the sense that it will be available as an e-book. Okay. Oxford also have a number of modernist first editions, and the last I heard, because I'm not working with them, they were somewhat how to put it, mired in the complexities of their rather more ambitious hypertext format. So what I suspect will happen in terms of the lifetime of the edition is that initially we are talking about ebooks, and then a process in which hypertext formats, when they perhaps become more standardized, take up and allow access in the ways that hypertext versions offer over e-text versions. But I think immediately in terms of accessibility compared with the earlier Cambridge modernist texts, I'm thinking of the Conrad and the Lawrence, which were very expensive when they appeared in book form, having electronic versions will make it more accessible to Forster scholars. So thank you for that, Claire. Thank you.
So is there a plan to make it, because I understand that what you're working on of academic editions, which will not really be readable for an average reader, but is there a plan to make a, let's call it clean text, such as the Abinger was made for Penguin?
There are no plans yet, but yes, I would very much hope so. Yes, that it does form the basis then for subsequently published texts. David alluded to one of the issues there, which is that often texts people believe are in some way authoritative may indeed be accurately checked against early editions like The Longest Journey. If what is being used is it's a big word, but it's a technical term, corrupt, then actually we are basing our work often on text that is not Forster, but actually a compositor, or the pressures of publishing. One of the most interesting issues, just as a sidelight, that we found is the role of early 20th century house styling. In other words, even with the first edition, to what extent do we replicate a first edition that increased the amount of punctuation that is used? Forster in his manuscript is quite a light punctuator, but some of those punctuation effects are very carefully calculated. There could be a whole paper, perhaps there will be one day, on Forster and the M dash, and Forster on long dashes. But particularly in the United States, actually, the look on the page and adding in punctuation very much changes the reading experience. And it's very difficult to know, very difficult to square both the imperative to base it on usually the first English edition, with the fact that those first editions were quite heavily house styled. So these are all very good points when one gets in. I mentioned the broad principles, but actually it's more messy than one would think. So yes, there is a need, I think, to establish for the wider reader and scholars the opportunity to access a more accurate text, or a text at least that goes back to a version that Forster saw the proofs of.
If I could just sort of chip in there in answer to Krzysztof's question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the reader's experience is very important, and so there's this kind of compromise between sticking rigidly to the copy text, the first English edition, and current expectations in little ways. For example, when Forster writes today, he writes to-day and to-morrow. Nobody does that anymore. It just looks strange and it's rebarbative. So do you want your reader to have the foreignizing, as it were, a recent experience of the original, or do you want the reader not to think, what's this? So there, and obviously whenever we do that, there would be a list in the volume saying, well, in the first edition and in the manuscript you have 2-day, but in this edition we don't have the hyphen, so it will be clear. I personally think, speaking for myself and not for the the editorial board or anything else, Cambridge UP, I think it's really important that we should move, after this is all done, towards trying to kind of make it more accessible and affordable, and that would be Penguin is a great model, particularly for the longest journey, because the Penguin of the longest journey is basically a photocopied version of the Abinger as far as the text is concerned. I mean, the pagination is absolutely the same, so it's really useful. I did have something more to say after all, it seemed. But
I just want to say that I think we have to finish now at that point, because lunch is waiting. If you could please just gather outside, and then there will be, our student will lead you there to the place.
it's all right. Yeah, something. Extemporised. I need to know what they were. Monica said, what